Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll start in about 1 more minute. I know we're a little bit late, and I apologize to everyone for that. But we're just still, we'll wait for some final attendees who are just joining as well, and then we'll start on today's webinar. Eric, are you good to go with everything?
Yep, I am good to go as soon as we are ready.
Okay. So I'll give a few announcements to everyone. Thank you again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world, for everyone for joining us. Um, my name is Jason Silberman. I am with BlazeMeter, and so is Eric Dapp, who's going to be presenting in just a couple of minutes. Just before we start, and today's topic, by the way, is performance test automation with JMeter and Taurus and Jenkins. All open source tools, by the way, though we'll show a bit of BlazeMeter at the end, like with showing reports. BlazeMeter is a commercial tool. But a few announcements before we start. One is today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive the recording likely tomorrow, if not by Thursday. So if you did miss something, that's fine. We got you covered, and you will receive the recording so you can watch you can watch it again or watch it for the first time in the next couple of days. Secondly, at the end of today's webinar, we're going to leave some time for questions, which you can ask in the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. That's the best way to ask questions. We get a lot of questions, really great ones, I know from previous webinars. But if you can try to keep the questions on the topic of today's webinar, that would be highly appreciated, and it also increase the chance that we'll be able to get to your question. We want to keep it as broad as possible. I'm sorry, as specific as possible to today's topic, so that the audience who is attending, listening in here, will find it valuable for them. Finally, as you might know if you've attended our previous webinars, at the end of the webinar today, there'll be a short survey that will pop up. It just takes 30 seconds to fill out, and it does two things for us. One is it allows us to get your feedback on to how what you thought about the webinar, but also suggestions how we can make them better in the future. Please, be honest in your responses. We look forward to that. But also, if you want to request, excuse me, a follow-up one-on-one demo with BlazeMeter to discuss your specific testing needs with one of our performance engineers, it will give you that opportunity as well. So with all that said, I'm now going to turn things over to Eric Depp, and the webinar will begin. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. All right. So, as Jason kindly pointed out, this is going to be a webinar focused mainly around Taurus. What Taurus is going to do is going to execute JMeter, and we are going to put this all in a nice automated setup so that I am always running the most current version of the tests that I'm creating. I'm just noticing that there's some pretty loud sounds coming in from outside my house right now, so apologies if you hear sirens. So, first question, why are we here? We're talking about Taurus, right? One of the main reasons that Taurus was created was to move testing closer to the developers. So this is, I'm not sure if you've been following any of BlazeMeter's marketing or the continuous delivery marketing that's coming from CA, but the idea of shifting testing left, specifically shifting performance testing left, right? Now, what that means is that you go from developers, to testing to deployment to all this stuff. You keep moving to the right as you move along your your software development lifecycle. So the idea of pushing performance testing left or shifting left is to get the ability for developers to test, basically. And testers are probably all right using something like JMeter, which is a GUI tool. It's a little bit outdated in terms of its GUI, and that's part of the reason why Taurus was created as well, is to give you basically a way to interact with JMeter and make performance tests, meaningful tests, but make them in code. So this has a couple of really awesome benefits to it. And I will actually get to all those while we're actually talking about the code itself. But the idea here is we're talking about shifting performance testing left and getting tests up and going faster and keeping them going once we've got them all made. So 4 fundamentals of what Taurus is. First of all, open source. It is actually free. There's going to be pretty much, I'd say 90% of what I'm going to show you today is going to be free. You can actually just make this yourself and do basically everything that I'm going to show you today. That red line under between number 3 and what is 3.2, I guess, that's where it stops being free, right? Number 2 here is Taurus is both a test runner and a DSL. It's a domain-specific language. So it is a native test compiler for JMeter, as well as some other open source testing tools too. And if people want to ask some questions about that later, we can go into a little bit more detail in kind of the broad strokes. But we're specifically focusing on JMeter today and performance testing. So 3, Taurus can run locally, which is a lot of what I'm going to be doing today. But it can also be run on BlazeMeter. And the reason it can be run on BlazeMeter is because we made Taurus, right? It's an open source project and anybody can contribute to it, but we are the sponsors to it, and almost everything that gets done on it is something that we have a heavy hand in, basically. Number 4, you can use BlazeMeter specifically just for reporting, so you can actually push your tests to the cloud and use our infrastructure, get great reporting from us, and make your tests accessible from other people, either publicly or allow them to come into your account. And if people want to talk more about that, you can actually get on a demo with me or with one of the other engineers here at BlazeMeter, and we'd be super psyched to show you basically everything there is about BlazeMeter. I'm not going to focus on a whole lot of that right now because this isn't a sales call. I'm going to give you a lot of the stuff that you can just do for free yourself. So if you want to go a little bit deeper with Taurus, one of my colleagues, Dave Caro, put together this great list of resources. So if you're transitioning from either you already know JMeter and you just want to move up and get into Taurus, or if you're starting from scratch, these are both really great. This is really great resources for both of those things. So this will be a recorded webinar and you all get a copy of this, so don't worry about having to copy this down right now. But I'll try to leave it up for just a second so you can if you really want to and you don't want to have to come back to this recording. That's okay too. But grab that, go to this, and you'll actually get a bunch of really good resources. It's some of just the best documentation that is available on gettaurus.org as well. And so what are we going to be doing today? So first of all, I'm going to be running Taurus locally and showing you basically how I'm writing tests. Show you a couple of different ways that I write tests, actually. We're going to get instant feedback on the tests that I'm running right as soon as I want to run them, basically. And the idea here is I'm going to show you that Taurus is a little bit more powerful than just running JMeter itself, just in its orchestration. I'm going to take the code that I'm writing and any of the things that I edit while we're talking. I'm going to commit that to GitHub. And I'll talk a little bit here at this point right here about reusing some of this code for various different projects, and that's kind of one of the it's one of the main features of Taurus 2 is the idea that you should be able to write code for a specific scenario and reuse that for different scenarios if you want to, and that applies to both the actual test scenario itself, like what a user flow is going to be in your system, and also the kind of execution that you're going to have. So that would be like the load configuration, that kind of thing. Now, the last part that we're going to focus on is going to be Taurus in Jenkins. So I'm going to set up a build that will basically just run a test for me and show you how we can just very easily extrapolate this to having a test run after any build that we want to. What I do actually is I have this build that I have run a couple times every weekend, just so that if I'm not doing these kind of demos all the time, I'm actually still getting data, I'm still getting it up, and I actually can go back and check and see if anything every week, if anything's gotten worse or gotten better or anything like that. So with that, just leave you with a little bit more information. If you go to gettaurus.org, and if there's not anything that you're finding in the user manual or in the knowledge base, you can definitely go to the support forums, and just a bunch of really good information there, and actually Andre, the guy who is the main man behind Taurus, as well as the main man behind a lot of JMeter plugins. If you go to JMeter plugins, I think it's jmeterplugins.org. He's the main man behind a lot of that stuff as well. He is on the support forum all the time, answering questions. He is the one doing the code, so he's the one who's going to know the most about it. So if there's something specific, maybe something that you asked during this webinar that I'm not able to answer, that would be a great resource for you as well. And I believe that's the end of my slides. Yep, cool. So I'm going to exit out of this, and I'm going to jump over to a lovely blank screen. Got a couple of terminals here, and this is what I'm going to be running, actually. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what we're seeing here in all this code, and basically explain every little part of it to you before I get to running any of it, so that you know exactly what I'm doing. Now, this will assume a little bit of familiarity with JMeter and what it's doing, but I'll give you a little bit of a primer on that as well. So JMeter specifically, its main use, like I would say 90% of what it gets used for, is HTTP, HTTPS requests. So that's protocol level performance and performance metrics, right? And so I can create myself a JMX file, which is your normal JMeter test, inside of the JMeter GUI. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to abstract that. I'm getting away from having to use JMeter's GUI, and we're going to write out our entire scenario like I have here in YAML. And YAML is a white space separated code. So it's a lot like Python, if you're familiar with Python, where the indentation actually does matter. However, this YAML, this setup, is equivalent to JSON, so you can actually just write this in JSON if you're more familiar with that and you like the key value kind of setup of JSON. The only thing that is really different there is that you're going to have a bunch of brackets. But if that helps you parse out your code like to your mind yourself, you can do them either way, both ways. It doesn't much matter. I happen to like YAML, and YAML is kind of standard for Taurus, just because I think it's just a lot cleaner, and I think that pretty much everybody agrees with that. So I'm going to explain first what is going on with my scenario. So this by itself, just so you know, won't actually do anything. It doesn't have any execution. I'm not telling it to run anywhere. What this does is write out a test plan, essentially. I'm saying, these are my scenarios. I've only written one, but I could make another one down here if I care to, and create myself a separate scenario alongside this. But I'm specifying the name for this test plan. And inside of this test plan, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a CSV file, which is, actually, if I just go and grab it right here, I should, yeah, have you right here. Bam. Basically what this is these are our pairs for cities, and I'll actually give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm going to be testing here. It's a I say like where you like an Expedia kind of a thing, except it's basically a real quick and easy kind of website that says, hey, pick a location that you want to fly from, where you want to fly to, and I want to make sure that I'm getting all the permutations of those that are available. So this is obviously a very simple use case of when I'd want to use this. More likely you'd do something like a username and a password, or credentials, or something that are going to be passed on as part of a post request. But here, I'm basically just giving you the idea for something that was easy for me to put together, but you'll be able to extrapolate to actual, useful use case. I can set up some headers here, and that'll be applied to every single request that goes through. I can also obviously take headers and apply them to each of the individual requests that are coming up, but these act basically as global headers. And this is a header that essentially is not going to do much for me, so I can put it there and I won't screw anything up. I can also specify whether or not I want to retrieve embedded resources from each of these requests that are coming through. So basically, if I want to download every JavaScript and every CSS and all the images and stuff that are inside of each of these, I can just change this to true. And it'll take longer for each of these requests to come through because it's going to encompass all of those extra, all the extra things that are going to be living in that website. But I don't really care about that right now. What I care about is response. And I just care about talk response. Now, obviously, the rest of this is actually just my requests, right? So I've got the URL that I'm going to be hitting every time I do this. I can set up defaults for these too if I want to have a base URL default and then just have a path on after that. It might actually be easier since these all have the same base URL, but I haven't gotten around to doing that yet. You can see here I've got 3 GET requests and just 1 POST request, and the POST request is actually using variables from my CSV file. So it's a very simple setup, but you can definitely extrapolate this to more interesting and longer tests. Now, before I go on, I kind of want to point out the value of doing it this way versus doing it in JMeter. If you create a JMeter test, you're going to basically create this huge XML file, which is how JMeter is going to parse that and put it into the GUI and allow you to manipulate it, and then it's what it's going to use to read the test plan from later. Now, that XML file is going to be huge. It's going to be, hundreds, if not thousands of lines, even for simple kind of tests. Now, if you go through and you set up this test specifically, right? And I want to actually go later, and maybe I just want to remove this first request. I just want to go in here and I want to take this out. I'm just going to comment it out here, but if I was going to go and put it into JMeter, I might disable it, or I might just entirely remove it or something. But that's not just going to take out 3 lines of code. It's not just even going to augment 3 lines of code. That's going to change hundreds of lines of code. All this stuff is going to be different. All these things are going to be out of place and weird things. For your normal use case, it's not going to be too big of a deal because you're not going to be looking at the code. But maybe you care about version controlling this code because you're probably going to commit this code along with the actual application code that you're going to be testing, or at least you probably should be, or somewhere around that. If you care about what's changed between the last time that you ran this test and the test that you're about to be running, you probably care that only 3 lines of code have changed. You are probably going to be a little bit worried if you see that 100 lines of code have changed since the last time you ran this, and you ran it 2 days ago, right? Who changed 100 lines of code in this test in the last 2 days? Well, JMeter did. But here, I can actually manage this much, much easier, right? So I'm just going to save that, make sure that I've got that there. Now, like I said, this isn't going to do anything itself. This is just a test plan. What I want to do is I'm going to execute this. And so I'm going to tell Taurus to run this test. This is JMeter test. I'm telling it which scenario I want to run. Remember that I called this Blaze demo over here. I'm going to tell it what kind of concurrency I want to use. And you'll notice I'm specifying different kinds of concurrencies here. So I have a local concurrency, which is 50 users. So it's a very, very small test. A slightly larger test if I'm running it in the cloud because I'm not actually using my infrastructure, so I don't care if it takes a lot of CPU power or memory to run this. And how long I want this test to hold for, it's a fairly short test, and how long I want the ramp up to be for this test. And also, if I want to run this test, in multiple locations, if I run it in BlazeMeter, and so this will be the like not free part later, the cloud here as well as the locations, I can specify those inside of my test. Now, if I run these locally, I obviously don't need these. I can actually just comment this out, I can comment that out, and those don't do anything anymore, right? Because if I'm only ever going to run this locally, you don't ever actually need those. I'm eventually going to want to use that, and so I want to make this as useful as possible in the different scenarios that I am going to run this test in. And actually, maybe I want to make this even more interesting for myself. I'll just take this entire executor right here, and I'll just I'll move it over here. So I'm actually there we go. So I've got this same scenario running twice, and maybe I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. Maybe I'm going to actually ramp up for 2 minutes, and then just hold for 30 seconds after that. And so the idea here is that I will actually get 2 scenarios. If I had actually written out a different scenario here, or if I just actually wanted to do maybe a script, like a JMX file, I can do my.jmx, and I can run JMX files that I already have, but I can override some of the load configurations for that. But if I'm more familiar with working in JMeter, you can totally use Taurus as a executor for those JMeter scripts, and and use it for the orchestration rather than just for the DSL part of it, which was the scripting that I showed you previously. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it with Blaze Demo, do maybe a higher concurrency when I run this in this scenario, and maybe I'm going to run a different location if I run this in the cloud later. But how do I find out what locations I can run this in? Well, Taurus is command line interface, if I haven't made that clear already. I'm not sure if I did. But the idea here is that I can actually, so BZT is the command line alias for Taurus. If I do BZT-locations, then this will actually spit out to me a set of, actually you'll see up here, I just did it previously. It'll spit out to me a list of locations that my BlazeMeter API key will allow me to run in if I run this in the cloud later. And so I'm just going to use this to help me write this test. I wrote my first execution here to run in 2 different locations in US, and I can actually check which ones those are here. US West 1 is Northern California, and US East 1 is Virginia. And so maybe I want to run this in like Asia or something. The one that I tend to like going to is Mumbai, so AP South 1. I can just copy that guy, drop that in here, and just say this. So the idea here also, by the way, just so you know, is that these are weights of how many users to put here versus putting here. And so if I'm just doing one, then I can just have a just like one location that I want to run this at. If I did locations weighted false, then I would be able to actually just run this on a specific number of servers in that location. And so I've got a lot of options when it comes to specifying how exactly I want to run this test. So I'm gonna leave these 2 executors here working together. And basically here, this is just some kind of like advanced Taurus stuff. I'm going to use this part here when I run this in Jenkins later, because there is actually a plugin in Jenkins that allows me to parse an XML file that can be spit out by Taurus like this. And basically it lets you get a little bit more information out of this without having to use something like BlazeMeter, where we get full-on awesome reports. And we'll obviously talk about a little bit about that later as well. Wouldn't be a great BlazeMeter webinar without talking a little bit about BlazeMeter. Every time that you run a test, you'll get an artifact folder, and automatically this will, or by default I should say, this will be put into the test that you are, sorry, into the directory that you're running in. But you can also just set up a template for where you want that to go. So I actually want it to live in a folder that's that I call artifacts, so it doesn't muck up the directory that I'm in. And then I'm also telling this what I want to name the test if I run it in BlazeMeter. So I'm going to get actually just some tests running here, just so we kind of are moving while I talk about a little bit more of what's going on. Let me close a couple of things here that I have from other stuff. And yeah, so I've got a couple more things I want to talk about in terms of Taurus before we jump over the actual automation part. But why don't I get a test running locally, and we'll just see what I mean by instant feedback of what's going on in these tests. So I'm going to run both of these at the same time just by running this execution in JMeter YAML. So remember I did BZT-locations for this one down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do BZT, which is BlazeMeter Taurus, which, by the way, I left you with a bunch of information about where you can find information about Taurus, but that gettaurus.org will explain to you where you can download or how you can get BZT. It is entirely written in Python, so it's a pip install, super easy. If you're on Mac, you can also install it via brew now. So BZT, I'm going to do my load scenario from CSV.yaml, which was this initial scenario right here. And I'm going to pair that with my execution JMeter YAML, which is this guy right here. I'm going to make sure that I've got both of these saved before I run this, so it's actually running the ones that I'm expecting it to run. And I'm just going to go nuts with that. And what this is going to give me is it's going to give me a console here with what I was talking about as instant feedback, right? Let me make this guy a little bit bigger so that when it updates, we'll get a little bit more information there. You can see here that I'm actually running those 2 scenarios. I'm running BlazeDemo and BlazeDemo, and they're both going to be 2.5 minutes long. But what we're going to see here is that one of them is going to ramp up right away to its, I think they're both 50 users. Yep. And then the other one is going to slowly ramp up over the course of 2 minutes rather than just 30 seconds. So after we get 30 seconds into this test, which should be about right now, so we should be at about that 50 user mark. And then slowly after this, we'll start adding more and more. And so you can see we're adding more, but we're doing it in a slower pace than we were previously. And so it kind of maxed out, and we're reaching a little bit higher shortly and shortly. We've got some hits that are going through, got some hits per second that we're seeing here. We've got like our average, we've got our average response times as well as latency over here. And we've got all of our response codes right here. This is the most useful part for me. I use this as basically a sanity check because I'm running this locally right now. I'm not running a really big test. I just want to make sure that when I'm running this, because this is a very simple test, that I'm actually getting 200 codes. Just so you know, too, you can build assertions into your JMeter script if you need to assert the validity of a response that's coming back. You can totally build that into these actual requests themselves. You can obviously also build those into your JMeter script, and they'll be utilized here if you need them as well. But that shows up in this console as well. So I'm going to let this guy play out while I talk a little bit about why I'm running these tests as separate YAML scripts, because you by no means have to. You just saw that when I ran BZT, I could just run BZT and a YAML file. You don't have to do an execution one with a scenario one. Or like any other extra things that you want to separate out, you can, because I like doing that. It makes it more modular, and I actually do have a reason for doing it. But if you are more comfortable with it, if you want to keep it all in one spot, you can totally just put it all in one big YAML file. I've actually got a version of this test that I run under it called execution JMeter merged. If I just look in here, then I've got the execution part of this test, I've got the scenario part of this test, I've got the reporting part, I've got all the things in here that I wouldn't normally have. I just put it all in one big YAML file. But I've got a reason for doing it separately like this. And it would actually make sense to take out all of these parts and put them into separate ones as well and make it more modular. But the way that I'm running this test is useful for me because I might want to reuse this scenario, but not with this executor. And I don't want to have to come and rewrite an executor every time I want to use it, right? I don't want to have to make a new full script for everything. I just want to reuse my scenario. And so I might use something like this, which is my execution JMeter stress, right? I have a much larger amount of users I'm going to use. It's going to run for a little bit longer. I could obviously make this like a really long, like hour test if I wanted to, or much longer than that, even if I cared to. I'm also running from different locations when I do this one. I'm still using my reporting modules that are going to spit out an XML at the end of this file, as well as I'm renaming the test when I run it in BlazeMeter. And so I've got a way that I can basically mix and match, right, parts of this test that are all going to work together because we're talking about the same scenario. And I'm just mixing and matching this part. If I have maybe a different scenario that I call Blaze Demo in a different scenario file that maybe does something else, that might be a more in-depth like dive into the services that are behind this website or something like that, then I can match my same kind of execution with the same number of users I'm expecting with a more deep dive kind of scenario. And I might write that out into something that is still called Blaze Demo, because I'm never going to run these two things together. I just want to run them separately, right? And so that allows me to run back and forth my execution, my scenario. I can run different load configuration files. It'll even be useful if you want to run different testing tools as well. So what did we get after running this test? We got some basic information, basically enough to act on. We look at this and we see we've got percentile information for our response times, which is super useful, as well as some average times for our response time and our latency. And it also is letting us know that it did dump those final stats into an XML file. So I'm going to just go and take a look at that real quick. It's not going to be something that's going to be useful for us, but just so you know, this is dropping some information here that will be able to be parsed. You can actually make something to parse this yourself if you want to. It's got percentile information. It's got average response time information, standard deviation response time. It's got a lot of stuff that might be useful if you want to parse this out yourself. But what I'm going to make use of is a plugin inside of Jenkins called the performance plugin. So before I do anything here, I'm going to make sure that, first of all, I get rid of that because I don't want this to be on my, I don't want that to be on my Jenkins when I run this test, I'm going to get rid of my artifact folder because I don't need to keep bringing in more and more data when I run the stuff in the cloud. And what I'm going to do really quick is just take everything that I just did, any of the things that I updated, I'm going to add this to Git really quick, and then we'll just make sure that it's there, and then we'll actually do all the same stuff that we've been doing, but we'll do it in Jenkins. So I'm going to do just real quick git commit real quick. So this is 2017 11/21 webinar. And so you can see all the things that I've just changed in here. I should have some extra stuff that I've done on top of this as well. Yeah, I created a new YAML in there. I've changed a couple of things, and so I'm just going to really quick just push this. And so now that should be in my Git directory here, so my Git repository. Sorry, so if I just update this guy, we should see that, yeah, I've got a couple of things that I've brought in here just real quick. So bam, 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 awesome. So I've got all my updated test files here. Now, why is it useful for me to have all my updated test files in my on Git? Well, I'm jumping over to Jenkins now. I'm just going to make sure really quickly that I'm still logged in here. Hopefully I am. Good. And I've got a project here that I'm calling the Eric Taurus demo because I'm egotistical and I like to have my name on all the stuff that I do. What you're seeing over here is the performance, the output of basically the performance plugin. The reason that we are using the stats XML when we run this test. And let's go real quick through the configuration of this. Yeah, let's go through real quick through the configuration of this, and then we'll actually we'll run a build, and we'll do a couple of things for us here. We'll do a couple of interesting things. One, note that I'm not doing anything super crazy. I'm going to integrate with Git. I'm using the GitHub repository that I just pushed to right now. And note that this is by no means the be-all, end-all of how you can do this. There's multiple ways that you can run this kind of thing. But what I'm doing here is doing a repository that just has testing files in it and tests that I want to run from. A more typical way might be to keep your testing files with the actual application files if you want to, and so that you can test them straight from there. I've got this test set up to build periodically, so it's going to build, I think, every Saturday, like Friday and Saturday. So yeah, this will run next on Friday automatically, but I can also have this trigger after other projects are built. So if I actually want to test the application that I'm going to be, sorry, if I want to build the application and then automatically have it be tested, I can have this run after every time that I build and deploy that application, right? I can also obviously trigger this remotely if I have some other extra idea of how I want to run this on a more like regular basis. Now, the only thing that I'm doing here, which is actually the reason that, or like one of the reasons that makes Taurus so valuable, is that I'm not relying on plugins to run the actual, like run Taurus itself. Because basically, I've got this, I've got Jenkins running on a server somewhere, and on that same server, I also have Taurus. So as long as you don't have any issues with permissions where Jenkins is allowed to execute Taurus, then you are good to go. You can go and execute shell. And the idea from here too is that you're not limited to just Jenkins. If you decide to not use Jenkins later, as long as you use a CI tool that allows you to execute shell, then you'll be able to run Taurus again. You are not giving up anything by using Taurus, and you are not relegating yourself to just running Jenkins later. So, with that said, note that we're basically doing exactly the same thing that we were doing when we were running this locally. I'm running BZT. I'm running my load scenario from CSV. I've got an execution in JMeter YAML. So these are the exact same files that I was just running. I just committed them to GitHub instead of running them from my local. I've also got cloud credentials, and so I'm including a way to run this test built into the test itself if I want to run this on the cloud. This is not currently going to be a cloud test, but very shortly I'll make it a cloud test. I've also included a pass-fail criteria here. And actually, if I just jump back really quickly, I think I've got that pass-fail right here. Yeah. So I've set up myself a module for pass-fail that says if my response time is over, my average response time is over 2 seconds, then I will just mark this test as a failure, basically. And this is going to be useful for adding another layer of potential way for this to fail inside of Jenkins, so that if that happens, if I get it over 2 second response time on average, then this build will be a failure, and I'll be notified of that, right? I will know when I've broken something if suddenly I've got a 60-second response time because everything is timing out all of a sudden, right? One last thing that I'm doing here is I'm having Jenkins deal with my stats XML, the one that I brought in, and I just want this to give me some performance information, right? The one that I specifically care about is the average response time, but there's some other things in here that I might care about too. And just with that, I'm going to save this, and I'm going to build this. We could obviously hang around until Friday and let this do it itself, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to build this while we're here. And we'll just go check out its console output really quick, just to show you that it's doing the same thing that we were doing locally. So you can see that we're running Taurus. This is running a slightly older version of Taurus than I was, but we can update this on our server if we care to. So yeah, we're starting with the configs that we've specified, and we're grabbing all the ones that we grabbed from GitHub. That actually should tell us that we got the stuff that we needed from Git, and now you can see we're actually just straight up getting information now. The only thing that I did a little bit different here from running it locally was that I actually told it not to produce the console that we were seeing when we were running it here. The reason being because the way that that comes out in a console output that's being printed like this is you'll have copy after copy after copy after copy every time that dashboard changes. That's not going to be super useful for us here. All right, so I'm actually I'll let this guy play out here. But if I jump back to this test here, I'm actually going to oops, sorry, I jumped out of my actual thing here. So this is going to produce another trending result for this here. You can see I've got occasionally really high response times. I've got occasionally 100% errors, and so there's been interesting times where I was trying to run this test that the environment wasn't up to be run from. So I'm going to make just one real quick change to this test, and just note that basically we've got an automated setup already with a couple of lines of code. I say a couple of lines of code, maybe 30 lines of code in total. I've got an entire automated setup now, basically. One thing that I want to point out to you though, before we go anywhere, is that if I now want to switch this to run a much larger test, I can do my stress, right? I can switch this out for one of my other executors that I've written out. I could switch this out for another scenario if I have a different scenario that I want to run. If I need to give this to somebody else, I can give it to them without the cloud credentials, so that they can put in their own cloud credential YAML, and they would have their own automated setup now if they wanted to. I can change this for a different pass-fail criteria. Maybe around testing season or something, I've got more stringent tests like pass-fail criteria that I want to use. Not super likely idea, but that might be something I might want to swap out as well. Now, the only thing that I changed running locally here, running here versus running locally, was I told it to use the option to not use the console, right? Modules console disable true. So straight up, pretty easy. And we already saw what that actually meant for what that meant for this, which was that we have a console output that is giving us recurring information, but it's not spitting out an entire console. We should actually, I think this is done now. Yeah, and so we get the same percentile information, average response time information, all that good stuff. And this is dropped to an XML file that our performance testing plugin is able to use, and it's telling us this was actually a success because we didn't have any errors, and we're all good. So super awesome. That's great. I'm going to do one more thing here now that that one's done, which is I'm going to jump back to this project. I'm going to go back to my configuration and make the teeny tiniest change that's going to make the biggest difference. So that teeny tiny change is to just go after my last YAML file. I don't even have to do it after my last YAML file, I don't think, but I can just do -cloud. Now, Dash Cloud is going to make use of the cloud credentials. And yeah, I don't have to do anything else after that. I've got Dash Cloud in there. If I run this test now, if I build this project, what'll happen is that yeah, go to my console output. We'll do all the same stuff that we did, but instead of running locally, we're starting a cloud test, right? So this is the point where it stops being free, right? Everything that I showed you up until now is entirely free. Taurus is free. There are free versions of Jenkins. You can rock all this out. Everything that you have seen up until now, totally awesome and free, and rock it out, and you can get performance testing up and going really rather quickly. Here, I've got a test that's actually being run in BlazeMeter. And so if you'll remember, I actually set this up to be a test that ran from Virginia, I ran from Northern California, and I ran from Mumbai. So if we jump real quickly back to our load configuration that we set up here, I've got a scenario with 200 users now that'll ramp up for 30 seconds, hold for 2 minutes, and will run from these two locations, which are California and Virginia. And then I've got one that does the opposite in terms of ramp up and hold, but will run from Mumbai, right? And that's exactly what it is that we're spinning up in the cloud right now. So in essentially an hour, I've gone from running tests at a small scale locally on performance side, and basically running these same tests in the cloud and automating it so that this will run every week. I can also obviously set this up to run attached to another build if I want to, and I already talked a little bit about that. But just so you know too, the thing that I just did is you don't need to run this from Jenkins in order to be able to do the kind of cloud test that we just did here, because it's basically the same Taurus that's running there that's running here. And if I run that same test that I ran previously, I can just do dash cloud here, and we'll get exactly the same thing. I've actually got my BlazeMeter API key set up in a file in my home folder, so I don't have to use it here. But because Jenkins, that Jenkins server is not owned by me, it doesn't have my BlazeMeter API key living in the home folder on that machine. So when I run this test, you'll see we're starting a cloud test, and this will actually just directly kick me to a new instance of this test that's being spun up in the cloud. We go over here really quick. You can see that we're actually running this test in the cloud, and we've got more in-depth reports than we ever could have gotten from JMeter, and we're actually running from, you can see, Mumbai, Virginia, and Northern California. And if you guys want to see more about this part of it, then absolutely feel free to follow up with a demo request. And if you are in the States, you'll very likely be hearing from me, because I will be the one that'll probably be giving you a demo, and so we can talk a little bit more in depth if you like. But with that, we've got about 15 minutes left for this webinar, and so I think that if it's all right with everybody, I will leave that for Q&A.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric, for the great presentation. Thank you to everyone for hanging tight, and also we see some questions that have already come in. Just to remind people, during the time we have now for Q&A, is you can ask it in the questions tab in the webinar control panel. Anything related to Taurus, a little bit about BlazeMeter, JMeter. But let's get started. Also, just one more thing, just a reminder, if people leave, let's say before the end of the webinar, if you're leaving now, just a reminder to fill out the survey if you can, that'll pop up. It's literally just a couple of questions, it'll take 30 seconds, but we do appreciate it. So Eric, a couple of questions that came in.
Okay.
One of them was, does Taurus support other load testing tools? I'm sorry, other testing tools, not just load testing tools, apart from JMeter. One of the examples given was Load Runner, but I think the question was in general. So if you want to take that.
Yeah, absolutely. So since Taurus is an open source orchestration tool, it supports a bunch of open source testing tools. So definitely not Load Runner, I'd say, but there is actually an interesting kind of caveat to that. But I will say that Taurus supports JMeter, it supports Gatling, the Grinder, Locust.io, I think Apache Bench, a couple of other like testing tools as well, and that all that information is on getTaurus.org. It also does support the execution of certain frameworks of Selenium. So those being things like unit test in Python, TestNG for Java, as well as JUnit in Java, and a couple of other frameworks as well. And again, all that information is on getTaurus.org, so you can check that out. The caveat to talking about LoadRunner is that if you are interested in getting off of LoadRunner, or you are just sitting on a maintenance-less LoadRunner install that you've had for a long time and you want to get on open source, something to check out if you want to get into Taurus is shiftleft.blazemeter.com, where you can actually just drag in a LoadRunner, a zip file of a LoadRunner project, and that will allow you to convert, it might be a little bit, it might be a lot of your HTTP LoadRunner to JMeter, or your true client to Selenium, and so you can actually get started with Taurus that way, because what it will actually give you is something that's a lot like cloud test in the background here. It'll be a lot like this kind of scenario, and this kind of executor, depending upon if it was a JMeter or Selenium one.
Okay. We got a question earlier about some of the things that you can do in JMeter, like especially with scripting, like thread group control, like running parallel groups of threads, bean shell script execution, JDBC request, etc. Can you do these within the Taurus DSL?
So there's not going to be full feature parity with JMeter, but there is a lot of it there. So a lot of the logic that you can do for sure will be in there. So you can definitely do your normal like JSR223 kind of scripting in it, or like you're just straight up bean shell you can do inside of this. Let's see. So a similar thing to running separate thread groups is running separate actual instances like I'm doing here. I can't off the top of my head remember if I can specify different thread groups to be running in the same instance, but that information would definitely be at getTaurus.org. You can check it out there. So in short, it's not going to be full feature parity, but there's a lot of what you can do inside of JMeter you can do here. I will note too that there's a couple of extra benefits though that you get outside of JMeter orchestrating it this way, even if you are using it with just a JMeter script. So if you specifically need something that you need to be able to do in JMeter, like maybe run a specific kind of thread group or do something extra on top of that inside of JMeter, but for some reason is not inside the DSL yet. And do note that it's open source, and we are actually, we dig people submitting changes to it and trying to merge like their updated parts of it into it. So if you want to actually add things like that, you can totally get involved with that. And it's something that if people ask for it, we will do it ourselves. But the idea of the benefits that you get of orchestrating it outside are that you say you want to run a specific JMX that has multiple thread groups in it. One of the benefits of orchestrating that with Taurus is that if you change like the number of users that you want to run, it'll keep the proportionality of the users, like the virtual users or the threads that you were using inside of JMeter. So that say if I was running a 10-user thread group and a 20-user thread group, and then I wanted to run a 200-user test in JMeter, but using my.jmx instead of Blaze demo scenario that I was running here, that I would actually keep 2 times as many users in my second thread group as there are in my first thread group. I would just be able to keep scaling it that way. And so you're able to utilize your knowledge in JMeter and make that kind of like super in-depth test scenario that you might not be able to make in Taurus, or you might be able to make in Taurus, but you're just more familiar with JMeter. But you'd still be able to benefit from orchestrating your tests in Taurus.
Okay. Some more questions about Taurus. Do you need to have Taurus installed on the Jenkins server to allow integration with Jenkins, or is there another option?
And there would be other options if you wanted them to be, but I would say that the easiest way to do it would be to just have it installed on your Jenkins server. If you wanted to, you'll have to have it installed somewhere to be honest. There might be I think a plugin for Jenkins as well that takes care of that dependency, and it'll take care of it for you. You could also, if you wanted to run it remotely, so if you wanted to put it onto a different server that you were just going to relegate to, this is going to be our load testing server, this is going to be our generation, it's going to our load generator, and then you could send a remote command to that, basically as acting like a load generating slave, to Jenkins if you wanted to. There would be multiple options, or if you for some reason can't have it specifically on your Jenkins server. But again, if you want to have more information about that, you can feel free to get on a demo with us, and we can have a more in-depth conversation about that.
Okay, some more great questions coming in. We got a lot of questions I can see already.
Cool.
Can assertions go across all requests in the YAML file?
Can assertions go across all requests? You can add an assertion to any individual request that you want to in the YAML file. It would be a fun little experiment to actually try to assert as a global assertion on top of this. I'm not going to do it while we're on here, but it would be a relatively easy thing to try out if you care to.
Okay. Let's see. I think you spoke about this a little bit before, but if you just, somebody asked what's a single or like two major advantages of using, like running a JMeter test in Taurus versus just in JMeter itself?
Major advantages are, I would say that the two major advantages of running a JMeter test that you've already written out in JMeter, but you want to run like just with an executor the same way that we've specified before with myJMX, is basically that you can write and debug your test with a small number of users, and then you don't have to rewrite your test or worry about using specific like JMeter properties at runtime to specify the number of users that you want to use or different parameters that you want to run. So like thinking things like your ramp up or how long you want it to hold for and that kind of a thing. So that'd be the orchestration side of it. I've obviously add on top of that, if you want to run multiple at the same time, it's actually a lot easier to do that rather than trying to build it all into one big JMX file or have one JMX file call another JMX file. And so you have kind of like an entry point JMX calling multiple. This acts as your orchestrator. And then obviously the big one on top of that is that if you want to eventually run those tests in BlazeMeter, then you're just one CLI command away from doing that.
Great. Somebody asked, is there a way to list individual URL stats from the execution shell or from Jenkins or from the Jenkins results plugin?
Individual. I'm not sure about that, but I'm not sure about that. I might have to do a little bit of investigation myself, but I would suggest that person to probably posit that question to the support forums on getTaurus.org, because there'll be a little bit more information on that probably from there, especially from Andre, who'd be an awesome resource for that.
Sure. On that note, by the way, I just want to say that the URLs that our colleague Dave Caro assembled that Eric showed at the start of the webinar, I will send that link with all the URLs. I'll send that in the follow-up email that will include the recording to everyone, likely tomorrow, if not by Thursday. You'll receive it. So I'll include that link as well, so you'll be able to access all of that. But basically, most, or if not everything that you've seen here, you can find out a lot more information and documentation at getTaurus.org. And you can see there's a link to a support forum, an open source support forum there, and you get a pretty quick response on a wide range of questions. So I can already see we're not going to get to every single question in the next 5 or so minutes, but that might be a good source as well. Okay, let's see, we have a few more. Can Taurus be used to run one JMeter file used for login and then use another JMeter file to run while logged in? If so, would you recommend doing that?
Yeah, you can do that. There's no reason that you wouldn't be able to do that. Um, it would be very similar to running two separate thread groups consecutively. One that does something for you, and then then one that is doing something that's only logged in. I would. The thing about doing that though is that I wouldn't super recommend it because you have to think a lot about how JMeter is basically using its whatever it's capturing for your login. So, say for instance, if you create a connection in your first thread group and it says, cool, go through my login API and give me back a token that I want to use, and so you use a regular expression extractor to grab that, and you want to use that in subsequent requests, right? That's very straightforward inside of JMeter and also inside of Taurus to use all in the same test plan. But if you want to use that in the next test plan, then you're going to have to do something a little bit more in depth, like probably write that to either a file or write it to a JMeter property, and then be able to pull that from JMeter property on the next one. And so basically what you end up doing is managing two test scenarios when you may as well just do one test scenario. By the way, you can use the logical block of do once inside of JMeter, which would be a more probably beneficial thing for you to do if you just care about going through this and then doing the situation once, and then never having to do it again for that user, where they can go through your login, and then every time that they iterate through the scenario again, they won't do that part of it again because they just need to, because they've only had to do it on their first iteration through where they've logged in, and then they need to keep going through the scenarios that they want to go through, but they're already logged in, and that way you don't have to go about managing extra JMeter properties, and you don't have to try to be even heavier and write those authentications to a file or credentials or whatever and read from that later. So I would recommend doing it in one if you can. It would make more sense to you probably, but that's just my experience. If you have a situation that might require it, there's very few that I could even think of that might require multiple, but that's the way that I would go about that.
Okay. To wrap up here, just a couple of final questions about like the link between Taurus and BlazeMeter. One is somebody asked, does the reporting look different from just the Jenkins and Jenkins and Taurus? Does like the test reporting look different than from the basic BlazeMeter reporting? Like I guess he means basic, meaning like in the free version. That's one. And then also I'll kind of make this a two-part question for you. Does Taurus come, like if you have a BlazeMeter account, does Taurus come with that?
Okay. So when we're talking about BlazeMeter reporting, we can just jump over here. BlazeMeter reporting is going to be much more in-depth, but if you're talking about just the free reporting, it's actually the same as if you have a paid license. The only thing is that you can only run, you won't be able to run a 500 virtual user test or near that, or for as long as I usually run them. This is a very, very short test. It was only 2.5 minutes, I think. But so you'd be able to run something like that, but not a 500 user test. As far as reporting goes, it's going to be much more in-depth than what you get out of Jenkins or what you get out of JMeter. Obviously, I've got all of the extra things on top of it to be able to basically drill down into the different KPIs that I'm seeing for this test, as well as obviously all the raw information in my logs and my error report. And I can actually come in here and run this test again, and I can set this up to maybe be scheduled from our API if I want to, using our master ID. There's a whole lot of stuff that I can do inside of BlazeMeter that is not something that's going to be allowed inside of just straight up Taurus and Jenkins. But when I bring them together and I integrate that part of it and I say run the tests that I've been creating in my open source tools and scale them to the cloud, that's when you're getting to the commercial aspects where you're getting a lot more for what you're paying for than just the free tools, right? Obviously, it's in our best interest for everybody to get on the free tools because eventually you might want to have bigger and badder tests that we can definitely help you scale up. But the question that was part two was if you get BlazeMeter to Taurus come with it, Taurus is free. Taurus comes with everything. You can go and grab it yourself. You pip install BZT, and you've got Taurus. So you're able to actually start doing your performance tests, at least on whatever scale that your machinery can run. right now if you really cared to. If you're on Mac like me, again, you can install it with Brew. So it's a real quick and easy thing to get. So with a subscription of BlazeMeter, we won't you know, give you Taurus with it, but that's because Taurus isn't really ours to give as much as we sponsor its productions. Like you go and get it. It's on gettaurus.org. We'll tell you everything you need to know about it.
But I think I'll just add that you can launch a Taurus test from the BlazeMeter dashboard.
Yes, you can if you want to. You can come in here and you can do a Taurus test and drop your YAML file in here. I'd say the most natural way to run it is from CLI, but yes, you absolutely can come in here and do that.
Okay, that sounds great. So I see we're at the top of the hour. Eric, do you by any chance, I know we kind of got started with the webinar at the last minute, but do you by any chance have that last slide with the final links from the previous webinar? Or if not, I'll just kind of name a couple.
Oh, I am not sure if I have that on
Okay,
here.
so then don't worry about it right now. That's fine.
Okay.
So basically, I just wanted to tell people that I'll send you a few of these links in an email tomorrow, but if you want to find out more information about Taurus, that's gettaurus.org. You can actually see it in one of the slides there on the screen right now. Secondly, if you want to open a free BlazeMeter account to try out BlazeMeter and look at the reports and to find out more info, you can do so at any time, and you can start testing right away. That's at blazemeter.com, and you'll just see a Start Testing button. We have a lot of great resources on our blog, including a resources page, which you'll see there as well, which has all of our previous webinar recordings and white papers, instructional videos, and a lot more. We also have a great blog at blazemeter.com/blog. If you want to actually learn a lot more about how to use Apache JMeter, we actually have a new something called the JMeter Academy. I'll maybe send you a link to that as well. We've been receiving really good feedback about that so far as well. And final reminder, if you can, please fill out this survey that's going to pop up in a minute. It just takes 30 seconds, and we'll give you the opportunity if you want to also request a follow-up session on any specific topic relating to BlazeMeter, to Taurus, to the integration between the two of them, and Jenkins as well. You will be able to do that as well. My very big thanks to our presenter today, Eric Dapp. My very big thanks as well to the audience, everybody who attended, wherever you might be all over the world. We hope try to get to as many questions as possible. If we did not get to your question, we have it in our system, and we'll take a look tomorrow and try to get you a response if possible via email over the next several days. So please be patient with that as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day wherever you are, and you will receive the recording in the next few days. Bye, everyone.